People are still joining. All right, great. Welcome to this session about dev containers and GitHub Codespaces. It's really nice to be here in Porto. I've been to most of the other NDC conferences delivering talks, but never been here, so it's really nice. As coming from Sweden, I really can appreciate the weather you have here. It's really, I feel like home, but although it's hotter here, but the rain and the wind is beautiful. So my name is Jakob Ehn. I'm living and working from Stockholm, Sweden, for a consultancy company called Active Solution. So we're building a lot of cloud stuff. I also do a lot around DevOps, which is a topic close to heart. I'm an Azure MVP and so on, and I like sharing knowledge, in particular doing talks like this, meetups, conferences, and so on. And I've been a consultant for a long time, and this strip by Dilbert is really resonating with me, and maybe some of you as well. Because this is really the case when you come to a new project. You want to start coding immediately, so you pretty much you download the source code, you open up your favorite IDE, and you just want to start building and writing code, but that never happens, right? So this is very typical the case. You spend days trying to get everything set up, to get all the tools you need, the correct version, all the dependencies, and so on. And that's really a struggle, switching between projects within the same customer, between customers, and so on. So basically, you feel like you've done nothing after a few days. And these are things like, I talk a lot about DevOps, and many people do, but typically that discussion starts after code is being committed to your source control. Then you talk about how you build the stuff, how do you test the stuff, all those sort of things, which obviously is very important. But even before you can commit anything, you need to set up a developer workstation. You need to spend all this time to actually, before you're spending your first commit. And the works on my machine problem, you probably heard that one before, and it's really a struggle because after a few days, once you get everything working for that particular project, you probably made some changes along the way. You can't probably even describe what you actually did. There may be some document on the wiki that describes what you need to do, but 9 times out of 10 that document is outdated and doesn't really apply anymore. So you spend time trying to use an old manual trying to get these things to work. Also, the hardware specification seems to be increasing what you need. Building microservice applications tends to require a lot of resources that you might not have on your local machine. So these are quite common problems, I would say, in software development. And if we're talking about development environments, obviously that includes your favorite IDE, like Visual Studio, VS Code, Writer, what have you, and the code itself. But in addition to that, you need more to actually be able to actually work on your project. You need the correct tooling. You probably want the right extensions that will simplify your development. You need the right SDKs. You need all the dependencies, the correct version of everything. Then you want to have some settings that apply to you, like your favorite code styling, like color themes, those kind of things. Also settings that could apply to the whole team. Also, typically, you might want to have to do more than just download the code. Maybe you have to run some scripts to actually get things set up properly in your environment, and so on. So all these things is really part of your development environment. And again, this is different depending on which project you are. Because the problem is, I have one machine, and I work with a lot of projects, a lot of customers. So I try to in the end, I will try to have one size fit all here. I install everything on my machine in the end, so I can work on all my customer projects. And it's just a pain having multiple versions of everything on my machine. So wouldn't it be nice? We talk a lot about infrastructure as code, for example, putting things in the code and storing it together with the application code, so you can have your environment, your production environment set up. But wouldn't it be nice if we also could do this with our dev environment, so we could put that in source control? So the idea is that we put everything that I just talked about, not just the code, but also everything you need to work on that particular project inside source control. Then that will also be versioned. It will live along the application. And typically this will be project specific, as I mentioned. In one project, you might working on like the latest .NET Core and so on. In another project, maybe you're working on a lower version, maybe you're working with Java, maybe it's a front-end application. You know, that will really be project or team specific. And the end goal is really just allow us to be more productive and quickly more productive, easier to switch between projects. Also makes it easier once you start upgrading things on your project. If you decide to move to the latest .NET Core version, you can check that specification in, and all of the developers will automatically get that dependency without really have to find out themselves. And optionally, you could also think of this, in addition to this, you can also rent your development workstation, meaning that maybe you don't have to work on your local machine, right? Maybe you can use some machine in the cloud and just pay for the amount of resources that you're using. So with that, I'm coming to the GitHub Codespaces. So how many here are using GitHub on their day-to-day work? So not that many. How many are using it for personal use and pet projects? So that's more. And this is quite common. And so the good thing is, I'll talking about GitHub Codespaces. Obviously, that requires that you're using GitHub. But I'll also be talking about the technology that it builds upon, which is called dev containers. And that's something you can use today. You have been able to use it for many years, actually. You can use that locally using VS Code. And you can get many of these benefits without actually having to use Codespaces. But Codespaces, like the tagline is blazing fast cloud developer environments. And it says Visual Studio Code backed by high-performance virtual machines that starts in seconds. That sounds really nice, right? So the idea is you'll be using VS Code, or maybe you work in the browser, but everything will happen on the machine running somewhere in the cloud. So these environments are completely managed by GitHub. You don't have access to them. They're running somewhere in the cloud. And you can access them from anywhere. So you can just open a browser somewhere on your iPad, or you can use your desktop and connect to it using VS Code, for example, or other IDEs that actually supports Codespaces. But it's not just a machine, it's actually your development environment. So you can customize these things to fit your project, to fit your team, and your personal preferences. And you can select which machine size you want to use. Obviously, you will pay more if you select a more expensive machine or a faster machine. So, okay, I actually have a slide on the pricing later, but it's a pay-as-you-go, and you get 60 hours per month for free, which allows you actually to do a lot of work. You won't be able to work for the whole month using it. On the other hand, maybe you don't use your machine 8 hours every day. Maybe you have meetings that you don't need them, so you can really kind of fine-tune this. And maybe you don't need the most powerful machine all day long. Maybe you can use a smaller size, and then in some part of your work you can use a more powerful machine, which will then cost you a little bit more. So again, the idea is then you'll be sitting to the left there with your code editor on your local machine, and somewhere in the cloud there is a virtual machine running. Inside that virtual machine there will be a Docker container that you don't see. Inside that container, that's where everything will happen. So every time you save a file, run the build, run the program, it will actually run inside that container. So you basically have a thin shell on your local machine. So VS Code is built like this. So the interesting thing now is that besides from the actual hosting around this, which is GitHub Codespaces, inside this, it's built on this technology that I mentioned, which has been around for, 4 or 5 years, which is called Visual Studio Code Remote Development. So VS Code was built like this from the beginning. It kind of separates the client from the server, which allows it to actually connect to something, and everything will happen there, and you'll be sitting pretty much with the UI. So by default, that will be in the same machine when you run VS Code. But you can select now to use a container, a remote machine, or WSL as your remote. So then everything will happen there. And this is what GitHub Codespaces is built upon. But you can use this also without GitHub Codespaces, and you get a lot of these benefits. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So again, it works like this. You have VS Code to the left. That's where you have like your UI. You'll have the source code downloaded to your machine. But everything that's going on there is actually going on in the server part of VS Code. So again, when you're building things, running things, testing things, that will happen inside that container, and the source code will be mounted inside that container. So again, why would you want to do this? Well, again, the idea is then I don't have to have all the things necessary on my machine. The only thing I really need now is VS Code, and I need something like Docker. There are alternatives to Docker, like Podman, but I need something that can run my container. That's it. I don't need anything else. I don't need like .NET installed. I don't need to have a SQL Server installed or anything that I need to run my project. I just need those two things. And that makes me actually very flexible, very efficient, because it makes it so much easier for me to start working on the project. Everything is defined, in a specification that I will show you shortly. So I'm going to show you how you can easily get started with these dev containers. How many here have used them? 2 or 3 people? That's good. Maybe 4. So to actually being able to use these remote containers, you need 2 things. You need, 3 things. You need VS Code, but then you need, as I said, Docker or Podman, a container technology installed on your machine. And then once you want to start using it, you need to install the dev container extension. This one. So when you install this one in VS Code, that's when you're able to actually start working remotely against the container. So container is one of those options. You can also work directly against a remote machine, but I'd say the container part is the most is the best one here. So just to quickly show you how this actually works, if you install this one, you get access to various commands, and one of them is just to try dev container sample. So let's try this one. Can you see back there? It seems a little bit. Is the contrast okay? Back, you can see? Okay. So this is just samples to get you started from Microsoft. And so I'm a .NET guy, so I'm going to select the .NET one. So what will happen now behind the scene is that it's going to create a container. First time it's going to download that image that is necessary to run this thing. Then it's going to pull up a container, and it's going to clone the source code inside that container, and it's going to connect to it from VS Code. So the first time, this will take a little bit of a time. The next time, as you have it, it's going to be really fast. It's going to be exactly like you're working on your local folders. So we're up here. Okay, so now we're inside VS Code. I have my .NET project over here. So everything looks pretty much the same. There's nothing different here. I can edit my source code. I can compile it. I can run it like this. Nothing special really in terms of how you work with these things. So it says hello world here. Okay, but so what's actually different then? Well, as you see down here, at the bottom left here, maybe you see it. This little icon here specifies that you're actually connected to something here. You have VS Code locally, but you're actually connected to something. In this case, and here it has a name that is specified somewhere. And if I go to my terminal now, I'm running on a Windows machine. But if I open up a terminal window here and run some commands, you will actually see that I'm actually in a Linux environment now. So I'm actually inside that container. So that container is now my development environment. So for example, if I do .NET and see what I have in terms of SDKs, it says I have .NET 7 installed, which is what I need for this particular project. So just to show you, if I would go outside to my normal, like the PowerShell, run the same command, you see I have all of these things. And this is typically what happens, right? If you have one machine working with many things, in the end you'll have everything, and after a while you just says, okay, I have to reboot, I have to restart it, because now it thinks it's just too messy, it's too slow, I have to go at it again. So again, this is now the idea. to work on this particular project, I need to have .NET 7, a particular version perhaps, and that's available inside a container now. So again, if I run the build and the run, it actually runs inside a container. And just to show you, if I open up I have Docker Desktop installed, so it will now show me my running containers. So I have one container running, and you can see here, it uses a Docker image, which says it's from Microsoft. It says dev containers. It says .NET 0.7. So that's like one of the available images you can use to start working on a .NET 7 project, for example. So there's many of these available, and you can also obviously build your own ones that contains the things you need for your projects or your teams. And so actually, you also maybe noted that when I ran the application, it's running inside that container, but I could access it like through localhost port 5000, you can see up here. And that is done because automatically you can actually see this notification down here. VS Code, understands that my application is running on port 5000, and you can also see this if you go to the port mappings here. So this is pretty much done automatically for you, but you can decide here which ports do I need to expose from my container to the outside world, which is again my local machine so far. So maybe you want to run multiple things on different ports, then you can forward them outside here. So that's a quick start, just one of these samples. So let's talk about how you can customize these things. So when you want to create this dev container, you're going to create this JSON file called a dev container JSON. This is now the specification for my development environment. And this is now what will define the base image, the tools that I want, and various settings and so on. And here's an example of like a stripped down version of a dev container file. So let's just walk through it a bit. So first one, you have the image, and you can see that the same image that I showed you just before. So this now, in this case, it points to an image from Microsoft. It could very well point to an image that you have built. I can also point this to a Docker file. I will show this later on if you want to customize it locally in this project. But this is now basically your virtual machine, right? That's where everything will be stored. In addition to this, I can customize various things. One of them is I can add extensions. So VS Code is a lot about extensions, right? You want/need various extensions to be able to work efficiently. And again, these extensions is, in the end you will have like 500 on your local machine, but really you only need a set of extensions for each type of project, right? If I work on a Node project, I don't need all the C# extensions and vice versa. So a much better idea than is to actually put them in here. So I'll just specify then that these are the extensions that I want. In this case, maybe this is a bicep extension. So I'm probably working on some infrastructure as code here. You have the port mappings. So ports will automatically be forwarded, but you can be more specific here, which ports you want to forward. And you can also add some labels to it and so on. You can run various commands for like pre-create, post-create, post-start, those kind of things. That can be very useful for many things. For example, to run various startup scripts. Maybe you want to see the database or something like that, and you want to have that done when you start the environment. So you can put that in here, and then this will happen for all developers opening this. So let's see what happens now, because let's open a project that is that doesn't have one of these things. So now I can close the remote connection and go back to the normal one here. So let's open this demo. Oh, actually, it already had one from before when I ran this. So let's delete this and start from scratch. Okay, so again, I just have a super simple Hello World .NET application, which I could run or build and run locally as usual. But now actually I want to work with this project inside. I want to specify a dev container that I and all the other persons in my team can use. So to do that, I can again use the quick command, or I can actually also access the various commands from at the bottom here. And so I click here and I say add dev container configuration files. And if I go here, you can select between a lot of various available templates. So depending on what you're working here, this is like a long list, and just you can find the good starting point, and then you will be able to add upon it. So depending on the tech stack and the tools that you need, you can select from this list. So let's write C# here, and we can see there's various examples of C#.NET here. So I'm going to use the base one here, and select which version of .NET I'm using. So it's 0.7. And now it asks me, do you want to have some additional features installed? So feature is a nice feature in the dev container tech, because this allows you to very easily add more things to that dev environment. Everything here is based on Docker, so you'll be able to, if you know Docker and Docker files, you can pretty much add pretty much anything you want. But sometimes that could be a little bit complicated to install the right tool in the right way. So they have this concept of features, which makes it really easy to install things without knowing how it's actually being done. So for example, let's say in this project, maybe I want to work with Azure, so I want to have the Azure CLI available in that dev environment. Then I can just select that one here, and it will be installed for me. So let's go back to this file later, but if you note what happened now is that VS Code now says, hey, this folder contains a dev configuration file. Do you want to reopen it and actually work inside a container instead? And this is actually the experience that will happen if another person in my project downloads the code and opens VS Code. This one will pop up because there's a dev container file there, and from that point on, they can continue working inside a container instead. So I'm going to click on the reopening container. And again, it's going to do the same magic as before. It's going to close down, start the container. The source code is already on my machine, so it's going to be mounted into that container. And in a few seconds, I'll be working again like before, but now, again, inside this container, inside this Linux container. And again, we can verify this by seeing that now I actually have a new container running. And you can see now actually having a kind of a customized image here. So let's just build it again to run it to see whether that actually works. So if you're using VS Code, you see there's not really any difference on how you work here. And I can run it. So great, it works just like before. But okay, so what actually happened when I did this? Well, it added this dev container file, so let's take a look at it. So you can see the convention here is that it's creating a .dev container folder at the root, and then it's putting a dev container JSON file. That's by default where it's going to look for this file. You'll actually, we'll talk about that later in Codespaces, you can actually have multiple of these files. So there's a lot of commented stuff here because this is like the startup, and you can kind of uncomment things here. So again, I'm using this base image, and here you can see now the feature that I added here. When I select Azure CLI, that's all that goes into this specification file. So I don't really need to know how the Azure CLI was installed. But again, I should be able to actually, run AC inside my container here, and I have access now to the Azure CLI without actually having to install it on my machine, which is really nice. So that's pretty much it from a starting point. I can give it a better name. My cool app. So again, I could, for example, add the post create command. So maybe I want to have a .NET restore every time I create that container. And so that's one of the things. Then extensions then is a really common thing to actually add to your environment, right? So if you're using VS Code, you'll be using extensions all the time. So if I go to the extensions tab, you can now see actually now that it's kind of separating the local ones from the dev container ones. So because I can have extensions installed on my local machine that will be always available. But then I'll have a set of extensions on my dev container, and that will be more specific to this particular project. So if you're looking at here, you can see that I have the Azure CLI tools available because that was a feature added. Also, some of these other extensions come with that base image that I selected. If you're using the .NET base image, you pretty much always want to have that C# extension, for example. That's why that's automatically installed for you. But let's say I want to have some other extension. Let's search for .NET and see what we find. So let's get, maybe we want some snippets. Maybe we want everyone on the team to use a set of snippets here. So normally, if I select an extension, I would install it on my machine. But now I want to have it added to that dev container instead. And that's actually really easy. I can just right-click here and select Add to Dev Container JSON. So you don't even need to figure out, the exact ID. You just do this one. And if we go back here and look at the file, we'll be able to see that it actually added these somewhere. Oh, actually, maybe it didn't. I didn't say that one before. Okay, so now you can see that it added the extension here with that correct ID here. So now I'm editing that file that is really the base for the container that I'm working in. So I want to change the environment that I'm currently working in. And as soon as I did that, it actually popped up down here. Maybe you saw that. It says, hey, you actually changed the configuration file. So you might actually need to rebuild this container to apply these changes. So I can select rebuild from this one when I'm done with my changes. And so this is how you actually change the environment that you're actually working in. Add things to dev container JSON and then just rebuild it and reopen it, and then you're good to go. And again, when I push this and other people on my team download it, it will automatically have these things. It will have the CLI extension, Azure CLI, it will have the correct extension and those things, all the settings. So a really nice experience, actually. And this solves a lot of these problems that I talked about before. And this is tech you can use today. It doesn't have anything to do with GitHub. And that's an important point that I want to stress, because I know people think that GitHub Codespaces is for Codespaces, it's for GitHub, which it is. But it's built on this technology. So, and okay, so this was kind of simple examples. It's just one simple web application. It wasn't dependent on anything, but that is not really the case for most of us. We're typically dependent on more things, right? We will typically have a database or some other service or a cache or some of these things. So what is supported here is, in addition to like the plain Docker things that can run one thing, it also supports Docker Compose. And Docker Compose is really a tooling that allows you to run multiple Docker containers that will talk to each other. So it builds upon this Docker Compose tooling. And this allows us to then run multiple things. So for example, if I have an application that is dependent on SQL Server and Redis, I can specify that in a Docker Compose file and refer to it in my dev container, and then everything will automatically be spun up when I open that dev container. So let me show you how that looks like in another example here. So let's close this one. And I'm going to open my old demo project called QuizBox. So this application is a web application. It's a web API, and it uses SQL Server to store the data. And I don't know, this one pops up all the time. So again, it's going to ask me to open this in a dev container because it's a dev container file there. So I'm going to open it, and then we can take a look at how it actually looks. And just to be clear, you don't have to go this way everywhere, because VS Code will allow you to open these containers directly. You don't have to go to the folder and then click that thing. You can open it directly. I can show you that later. So once you have opened a project in a dev container mode, you can just open that one again and again just as if it was an actual folder. So if we go to Docker now, you can see that it actually has 2 containers running now. So the lower one is my dev environment. You can see that it's using the 3.1 .NET Core image. So this is actually old tech. I haven't updated it in a long time. But also kind of proves the point. It's much easier now to work with kind of legacy tech without actually having to install that one on my machine. But the other one is running is the SQL Server one, because I need SQL Server running. So now it's also automatically running as a container. So that means that we should be able to build and run this just without doing anything extra. So build, restore. And I'm going to use my default. I have a run all here, which will spin up the web and the API. And let's see what happens. Oops. So again, it says I found you running on port 55,000. So let's open it up, and this is my really old web Quizbox web. And I can run it. It will actually talk to the database, find out the categories and so on. So that's pretty cool. Now it's running. I just opened it in VS Code. I just hit F5. I didn't really install anything extra, but now I have running this one .NET Core 3.1 in a version that I don't think I even have it locally. And it's also using SQL Server without the correct version of SQL Server, without me having to install it. That's actually pretty cool. And going back here, I also added, let's take a look at this dev container file then, because it's a little bit different now compared to the one that I showed you before. We can close this one. And so the main difference here now is instead of pointing to an image from maybe Microsoft, I'm pointing it to this Docker Compose file. And so let's take a look in that one. That one is located down here. So Docker Compose, maybe some of you have worked with Docker Compose, but again, it allows you to specify and run multiple Docker containers. So again, the first one here, that's my dev container. And you can see that here I'm pointing to that .NET 3.1 image from Microsoft. And the other one, the DB one, it's not something that I want to build myself. I just want to use SQL Server. So in this case, I'm just pointing it to the 2019 version of the SQL Server. So that's a available Docker image from Microsoft. And I give it some configuration, the ports and the SA password and so on. That's all I need. Now it's going to be, and if I don't have that Docker image, it will automatically be pulled down the first time, and then it's up and running. And I also have some extensions in this file. For example, I have some SQL extensions for VS Code, which means I can, for example, peek inside my database from inside. So here you can see the actual database. So again, just an example of this is my environment, this is what I need, these are my extensions. Yes?
How does your data, your populated database come into the container? So you populate it that you build, or?
You mean the actual content? Yeah, I populated the first time I run the application. So you can do it, but that's also something you can do with a setup script, for example, that runs the first time, which might make more sense. But that's a good question, how you populate, in this case, the database. This is something that needs to be run typically the first time you run the application or when you start your dev environment. All right. Okay, so we've seen how you can use this tech locally, specifying your dev environment, how it works kind of with multiple things, multiple services. Of course, there's more to it, but more configuration options. But hopefully you saw how easy it is to start this thing. And the power really comes from when you work in teams or when you work in multiple projects. Have all this information stored safely in source control. And it will live along when you branch your application, you can branch, the necessary dev environment. If you want to add a new service, for example, that relies on some new tech, maybe you need to add a cache or something like that. You can add that thing also, not just the code, but also the environment changes. and create a pull request, and everything will go back to your main branch in the repository. Okay, so let's go back to GitHub Codespaces. So now we know that this is what it builds upon. So what GitHub Codespaces add to this now is to use this tech, but you don't have to run this on your local machine. So they built a whole managed service around this. And it will work really in the same way, just that that container will run somewhere else. You'll still be able to work, if you want to, from VS Code. You can also work directly in the browser, because GitHub has the built-in editor experience, which is actually really nice. But again, everything will, when you build, run things, all of that things will happen in that code space, in that container. And you'll actually also be able to access it. So you saw when I ran like the local host, I could access it through port 5000 because that port was forwarded. Well, this actually works in GitHub Codespaces as well. Obviously, you won't use localhost in the same way. I'll show you how that actually works. But you can access things running on that code space from outside, which obviously you want to be able to do if you run like a web application. So here's the pricing that I talked about before. So depending on the size of machine, I think you can go up to 32 cores. This is what the amount of money that you'll spend, and you get a set of hours for free every month and some storage. And so you basically pay for this when you're running it. If you stop the workspace, you will only pay a small fee for the storage of that code space, as long as you keep it around. So you can do your own math to see how much it will cost. I think if you take the cheapest one and deduct 60 hours, I think it'll cost you around $20 per month. If you run it a full 8 hour every day of the month, that will cost you $20. But again, as I mentioned before, maybe you don't run it all the time. And also, maybe you can be a little bit more selective. You don't always need like the most powerful machine, right? If you're depending on what you do on the resources that you need. So you can be a little bit more selective here. So let's look at GitHub Codespaces then. So I go to my GitHub organization called Cloudy Stuff. And so I have various repositories here. So again, I have this super simple .NET application just to get started. So the normal way of working here would be I go to this one, I go to code, and in some way, using some tool, I will clone that code down to my local machine, and hopefully I'll be up and running in a few days or so, right? Okay, but what you'll do with Codespaces instead, you select the Codespaces tab here. In this case, I don't have a code space for this particular repository. So I can select either this fast option, just create a code space on this branch. I can also be a little bit more selective. So let's look at the options that you get when you create a code space. So first up, you select the branch. Obviously, that's the branch that will be checked out by default. But then you can change that, of course, once you're inside. The other one is the region. So again, this is running in Azure data center somewhere. Depending on where you are located, you probably want to select the closest region here. And the last one here is the machine type. And so you can see I can select 2 core, 4 core, 8 core, and the amount of memory can also go up. The last one, 16 core, is actually being disabled by your organization, which is me. So I disable it for myself. And that's actually an example of like things that you can configure around code spaces, which is very, very relevant for organizations. So there are various policies you can do. For example, disable the most expensive one, for example. And there's a lot of other things as well. So unfortunately, I can't select that one. But okay, let's go with the standard 2 core one. Okay, so what happened now is that it's going to open up. It's going to start a virtual machine somewhere. It's going to start that container. It's going to open up the source code, and then I pretty much should be good to go. So now I'm inside the web experience. Can expand a little bit. And again, this is just a normal .NET application. You can see that it's running like the post create commands and those kind of things. And if I open a terminal, again, you can see that I'm in a Linux environment here. Let's check the version of .NET. What we have here, in this case, we have 7.0.306. In this case, I don't have a dev container file here. You might have noticed up here. It's just my source code. So how did GitHub Codespace know what to use here? Well, it doesn't know really what I want, so it's going to give me a default dev environment that kind of contains a lot of things. And you can actually, if you run dev container info inside here, it's going to point you to like the image version, and then you can actually go to that link, and here you can see what's installed on this universal image. And that's a lot, because it tries to kind of cover most common things. And in some cases, it will be enough for you to get started, but in most cases, you will want to be able to be more specific than this. But it's nice just to get started with Codespaces. And you'll actually see now, if I'm building this and try to run it, using like the default VS Code mechanism for C# projects here. Let's try to run it. It's actually going to say that it doesn't have, this is the error you get if you don't have the proper C# extension installed. And that's actually, so that one is not installed in that default image. And so this is not really a nice experience if you want to use the .NET projects. So again, let's create our own environment in here instead of just using that default one. So you can use the same commands as before. In this case, it's going to be in the Codespaces here. So we can use exactly the same thing here, and you're going to recognize everything from here point on, creating a new configuration. So it's exactly the same file we're talking about. So I'm going to select .NET. I'm going to use it 7.0. I could install features. We can skip this for now. And this is now going to create that dev container JSON file. So same file that we just used locally can also then be used in GitHub Codespaces. And we get the same thing here in the web experience. It says that it seems like you made a change to your configuration. You want to rebuild that container. And this is pretty cool now, because I haven't checked in this file. It's just a pending change here. But either way, I can actually rebuild this environment. Because that code is still available on that virtual machine. Now it's going to rebuild the container that mounts that source code. So again, I don't have to check in. If I want to change something in my environment, I don't have to check it in and rebuild everything and iterate. I can just make the changes, rebuild, change, rebuild until I'm done, and then that is when I can check it in. If you like Docker logs, you can view them while it's starting up the container. But you don't really have to unless you make a mistake in that dev container file. Then it's probably going to fail here somewhere, and then you'll have to look at the logs to try to understand what went wrong with my dev environment. So now we're back in, and we didn't really look at the dev container file because we looked at it before, but now I'm using this .NET 0.7, and that image actually includes that C# extension, which means that I should now be able to run my application as usual. So let's do it. So did I run it? I don't want to install that one. Oh, maybe it's still building here. Okay, now it's running. Okay, let's see what happens now. Because now I'm running the application in that Codespace environment somewhere in the cloud. It still says, hey, you seem to be listening to this port. You want to open it in the browser? Yes, I do. So what happens now then? Before, when I showed you this, it went to localhost, right? Because I was running everything locally. But now this is running somewhere in the cloud. So what happened? Well, this is what happens. I'll get a really strange URL, which is kind of contain the name from my Codespace. And the port, so it just creates a unique name here, up here. And that means you can actually access your application running inside that container, inside that machine, somewhere in the cloud. Obviously, you want to do this in this case, I'm running a web app. I want to actually see that web application. So this is a URL now, and so you might be thinking, well, can anyone access this thing running on my machine now? Well, they can't. So if I take that URL, open in private mode, it's going to require me to log in with my GitHub credentials. So nothing will be, exposed for you. Everything is locked down behind firewalls and things. But if you want to, you can share this, which might be very relevant. So let's go back to the code space and look at the ports. So we can see how it noted my application listens to this port. That's why it was automatically forwarded. But it says visibility private. That's the default, so only I can see it, and I need to authenticate it with it. But if we take a look here, what I can do, I can actually change the port visibility. And so I can select these three options. So private is just me. Private organization means anyone in my GitHub organization can watch this. They obviously need to be authenticated, but then they can access it. So this is a great way for me, for example, to share maybe a thing that I'm working on, to be able to either have teams give feedback on it or a stakeholder, something like that. The last one is public. That means everyone will be able to use it. And so just to prove that, we can change it to public and go back. Just try it again. And this time I can go straight in. So right now you can access this URL if you want to have this great experience. And then again, just as I showed before, we can configure more things here. We can add extensions. We can configure things like post create commands and those kind of things. But from this point on, you just work in the same way as you want to. Now I'm using the browser, and you can pretty much do anything here. So in this case, maybe I want to check in my change now. So I'll create a branch, call it feature add dev container. Check it in. Commit it, yes. And it's going to say, let's publish that branch. Back to GitHub, and it's going to say, hey, you want to create a pull request? Yes, I want to create a pull request. Everything, you can see everything is done inside this web environment. I don't have to leave everything here. So it's really like a really smooth experience using this web environment. But if you still want to actually use VS Code on your local machine, you can do that. And I can click down here, and I can say open in VS Code desktop instead. And let's allow it to do that. So now it's going to open VS Code on my machine, but it's going to be connected to that container running in the cloud somewhere with GitHub Codespaces. So exactly the same experience that I showed you before with dev containers locally, but now it's running in Codespaces. And you can actually see that with when you install that extension, you also get this thing called the Remote Explorer, which will show you both local dev containers, but also GitHub Codespaces. So in this case, it shows me the information on this particular code space, like the branch and the settings and everything. It will also show me, if I switch to dev containers, I can probably see one of the things that I used before that I showed you during previous demos. So it's really up to you how you want to work. Quick work, just use the browser. Otherwise, use VS Code for your day-to-day work. So how are we doing time? It's okay, 10 more minutes. Okay, so let's go back quickly here. So actually, maybe just before that, I'm going to show you another code space that I've already opened, which is this one. So I already created a code space for that QuizBox application, just to show you that this also works nicely with when you have a more complex setup with multiple projects and SQL servers and everything. So this is exactly the same project. And when I run this, it's going to start up the same thing that I showed you before, but now running in Codespace. Again, it's going to start a SQL container. It's going to run my application. It's going to note my port. I can open in the browser, and I can see this application. But now on this Codespace URL. So this is not just for simple projects. You can use this for like more complex things as well. And that brings us to the next thing, because maybe some of you are thinking, well, this is nice for one repository, but microservices, we are doing microservices. Well, multiple repositories, or maybe we have a monorepo with many projects in the same repo. So how does this work? So So let's start with monorepos, right? That's when you have a lot of projects and they're all checked into the same repository. So it typically can look something like this. You have typically a folder for each project. And inside that is that particular service. So maybe you have service 1, service 2, service 3 for your microservices. Well, what's nice now with dev containers and Codespaces is that you can check this dev container file in you can have many of these files checked in, and you can store them below each of these services. And maybe they will also look different, right? Depending on what that particular service is, because microservices are all about technical freedom. You can have a .NET service, you can have a Java service. And again, this perfect setup, just check in dev container with the right stack, and you're good to go. So when you create a code space from a repo like this, you will actually be able to choose which one you want to start from. So if you're team A, maybe you're working on service 1, you'll select that configuration, and that's the code space that you will open up with, that definition. So it works really well for a monorepo setup. And this is up to you how you want to do this. You can also have like just one thing at the bottom, but then it's going to look the same for everyone, and you might want to be more specific depending on the nature of your services. So the other one is then microservices, typically in the sense that you actually have many repos. Maybe you have one repo for each service. So if you have that set up, you still need to have your dev container file checked into, it needs to be located in some repository. And what you want here is then, if I open up my service 1, for example, I want to be able to also work on the other services, right, and access them. So you can do this by using permissions in Codespaces. So in this case, let's say I have one service and I'm dependent on 2 other services. And I can specify this, because by default, a Codespace will, if you're logging into Codespace, you'll only have permissions to work on that particular repository. But using this, you can say that I also include access to this and this repository. Or actually, I can also use a wildcard and say, give full access to all repositories within this organization. And when you do this the first time, you're going to actually have this dialog that says, you need to authorize this, because this Codespace is requesting additional permissions. So if I open the Codespace for repo 1 here, it's going to say, actually, you're going to get access to this and this repository as well. You need to authorize that. This happens the first time. And just to show you what this can look like, I'm going to show you if we take another repository here. So I have the API. I have 2 different repos here. I have microservice API 1 and API 2. So let's go to this one and open a Codespace. And again, the first time I did this, I had to do that authorization, but I already did it once, so I don't need to do it again. But I just want to show you what happens now when I go in here, because I added some things to this dev container file. Because typically, in this case, I want to work on my service, but I also want to work on the other project as well and be able to call it and so on. So let's start it up. Come on, come on, come on. We still have 6 minutes, so we're good to go. All right. So again, it cloned my API 1 repo here. And oops. So actually, if you see here now, I just went a folder up here and I see what I had on my machine there. And actually, you can see I have both API 1 and API 2 here. And that's because I added one thing to that, or 2 things to the dev container file. So let's take a look at this one. So first up, I added the permissions that I talked about. And so in this case, I'm saying I also want to be able to work on API 2 repo, and I want to have full permission. And I also added an additional one, like a documentation repo. And you can see I can be more specific, with the permissions and so on. So in this case, they say this team maybe also needs to update some wiki page on that project. But either way, I include these things in like the permission definition. But the other one is the post create command. So this is a good example of something you can do when you create the code space. So this is what actually now clone that one. So I just added this one. So every time I open my service, it will also clone the other service, which will then bring it down to my machine and will be available for you to work on and access and run and so on. I believe GitHub is running on making this even more like simpler. So you don't even need to do this. Just point to repos and it will clone it for you. But currently, this is what you need to do if you want to work on multiple repos. And you don't need to be specific with the permissions. You can just say give full access to all repositories. If you want to keep it simple. But you can definitely be more specific. And maybe not all teams need access to all services. So you can maybe create like boundaries between your microservice system and say, in this case, I just want to work on these 4. Well, then you can specify that here. So both of these things, monorepo and microservices, works really well for the scenarios. So just a couple of things in the end. If you have complex projects, maybe some of you do, that can be quite large, and maybe also need to run I mentioned like running setup scripts. Those scripts can sometimes take a long time, and that can actually affect like the time it actually takes for you to start your code space. So a very nice feature is that you can pre-build code spaces, which means that they're already done. They're just waiting for you to start them up. So in this case, you'll get that icon that says, if you select this one, there's a pre-build ready, meaning it's going to just fetch one and start it up. And you can configure this on when do you want to make that pre-build and how often. So typically, every time you check in something in a branch, or depending on where you check it in and so on, you can trigger this. And this will actually, behind the scene, trigger a GitHub action, which will then build that image. But again, the point is now that this one it will clone the repo, it will run any setup script that you have, and just store it, and it's good to go. And because sometimes this can take a long time. And there's actually a very interesting blog post from GitHub where they described when they moved to Codespaces themselves. So they're using Codespaces to work at GitHub. And this blog post talks about how they went from a setup that took them, I think, over an hour for a new. If you selected a branch for the GitHub system and start working, it took about an hour to get started. So they went from 1 hour to 10 seconds. And one of the big things here was this pre-build, because they run a lot of scripts that initializes various things. And every time you switch the branch, you need to rerun that script and so on. So it's quite interesting, because they built this to support themselves. So pre-build really was made for themselves to start with. But it's really valuable for many customers or many organizations that have the same kind of problem. So if they can start things in below 10 seconds, then so can you. So it's not really a matter of waiting for these things to come up. They will come up really fast if you configure them properly. So with that, I'm actually done. We have 2 more minutes. So is there any questions? One question here.
What about Visual Studio and Rider?
Yeah, regular. So what about other IDEs? So Rider has support for Codespaces. I have to be honest, I haven't used that integration. I know that it supports Codespaces. There are some JetBrains people here, I know. So are you using Rider? Yeah. So I know they support it. I haven't tried it though myself. I only have used Visual Code. Visual Studio doesn't support it, unfortunately. Maybe that will come. Interesting enough, this feature was actually built for Visual Studio first. There was something called Visual Studio Codespaces that Microsoft built, but then they acquired GitHub, and then they kind of shifted focus a little bit. But currently, it's not support for like the full-blown Visual Studio. Yeah, yeah, it's the same. It's the same tech. Any other questions? One here.
Yeah, you showed how you use have one service in a monolith thing, but can you run multiple projects at the same time? And how can you run, let's say, 2 or 3 services at the same time?
When you say service, do you mean like an application?
Yeah.
Yeah. So. Yeah, so I mean, what I showed you with that quiz box, that was actually 2 applications running. It was both a web application and an API. So that was an example of multiple services running at the same time. In that case, it was running from the same repository, but that doesn't really matter if it's. No, it's the same Docker image. So think of this as your development environment. It's really the same thing as you're working on your local machine. It's just that you have, you configured it to contain exactly the things you need. But from that point on, it's really exactly like working on your environment. So it's not just for single applications. You can run, everything on that environment. Good question. Was there another one? Yes.
This is mainly for web applications.
No, not really. You can run anything in that.
Desktop applications.
Well, okay. Sorry. Yeah, so you won't really be able to run desktop applications on it because you can't really access that type of UI inside a container. But I mean, you can work on like background things like web services, APIs, queues. But desktop applications is a different thing.
Android or iOS.
Yeah, I mean, you'll be able to build them, but you won't be able to run them inside that container and access it, unfortunately. So that's like a limitation of a container technology, really. Good question. All right, I think we're out of time. I'll be here for a while more, so thanks a lot, and have a good conference.